Coming up on Arirang News, South Korea reaches out to the U.S. regarding Japan's new export restrictions on key tech materials. The U.S. says it'll work to strengthen ties with both countries. In the meantime, top officials from Seoul head to Washington. Experts warn that both countries stand to lose from the trade tensions between them and lose even more if they get worse. South Korea could lose 3% of its GDP and Japan close to 2%. And South Korea's defense ministry rejects claims in the media that it sparked alarm at the prospect of Japan getting involved on the peninsula militarily. It's 4 o'clock p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on our afternoon newscast. I'm Devin Whiting. Seoul's defense ministry has rejected speculation that Japan might get a role in UN command that could one day lead to a Japanese military presence on the peninsula. If that were true, it would badly inflame the tensions now growing between Seoul and Tokyo. Kim Ji-yeon explains.
South Korea's defense ministry denied suspicions that Japan could be militarily involved if an armed conflict broke out on the Korean peninsula. The ministry's deputy spokesperson said Thursday if Japan or any other country hopes to participate as a sending state of the United Nations command, they would have to seek the South Korean defense ministry's approval. The ministry said there have been no discussions or considerations with the U.S. on whether Japan could be an official member. In accordance to the UN Security Council resolutions that were adopted in 1950, the UNC can ask for contributions from its 16 sending states, excluding South Korea and the U.S. Also, the ministry said it told Germany it strongly objected sending a German officer to the UNC, and with that, plans to send an officer had been shelved. The ministry stressed any country that hopes to dispatch officers to the UNC needs Seoul's approval, citing the UNC's role of defending South Korea in adherence to the armistice agreement. The remarks follow speculation that the U.S.-led UNC is reportedly seeking to include Japan in the states that would be involved militarily if an armed conflict broke out on the Korean peninsula, raising suspicions it could help expand Japan's self-defense forces. South Korean media cited multiple government sources as saying the U.S. has been looking to expand the UNC's role in the region, using troops and equipment from UNC's rear base in Japan. Also, for the first time, U.S. Forces Korea, in an annual publication called Strategic Digest, have referred to Japan's military involvement, saying that UN command, quote, continues to ensure the support and force flow through Japan that would be necessary in times of crisis. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
U.S. forces in South Korea have for the first time acknowledged publicly that North Korea's Hwasong-15 ICBM can reach any part of the continental United States. Oh Jung-hee reports.
The first official assessment from U.S. forces in South Korea that the North has a missile that can reach any part of the U.S. mainland, the Hwasong-15 ICBM. USFK released this year's Strategic Digest on Thursday. It says North Korea has 3 types of ICBMs, the Hwasong-13, 14, and 15, and of these, the Hwasong-15 flies nearly 13,000 kilometers, putting any part of the continental U.S. in range. The Hwasong-14, the report says, flies roughly 10,000 kilometers and can reach most of U.S. mainland. The U.S. military said last year saw a much-welcomed detente on the Korean peninsula, and North Korea showed it was willing to negotiate and engage in dialogue. But the report was also cautious, noting that tensions have thawed in the past as well, and it's still hard to tell which direction Kim Jong-un will go. U.S. forces noted that joint drills with South Korea have been scaled down, but it's unclear whether the North will reciprocate with sincerity towards the diplomatic process and restrain its own conventional forces. Though Kim Jong-un has ordered some key nuclear missile sites dismantled, the report said there's a lot of work to do to achieve final and fully verified denuclearization. It claimed that Kim has not made policy decisions that will lead to sanctions relief or foreign investment. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
South Korea's National Assembly is holding its third and final interpellation session this afternoon with a focus on culture, education, and social issues. It's expected that lawmakers this time will be grilling government officials on the Moon administration's labor reforms and its healthcare policies. The controversy surrounding so-called autonomous private high schools is also expected to come up. These schools set their own curriculum and admission standards, but Seoul's education authorities recently decided to strip some of them of their special status. Diplomats gathered in Vienna on Wednesday for an emergency meeting of the International Atomic Energy Agency to discuss Iran's nuclear program and what to do now that Iran has violated the deal it signed. Two major powers at the meeting, China and Russia, blamed the U.S. for backing out of that deal. Hong Yoo reports.
In an emergency meeting on Iran's breach of the 2015 nuclear deal, a U.S. envoy said Iran's expansion of its nuclear program is an attempt to financially extort the international community. However, the U.S. statement emphasized that the U.S. is still open for talks with Iran without preconditions. While this meeting was taking place in Vienna, U.S. President Donald Trump accused Iran of secretly enriching uranium for a long time and warned U.S. sanctions will soon be strengthened. The IAEA had verified Iran's compliance with the nuclear accord until earlier this week, when it confirmed that Tehran had exceeded the stockpile of enriched uranium regulated under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Iran's envoy told reporters after the meeting that if the U.S. wants to talk, it should lift sanctions.
No country is ready to negotiate with a country that is putting the gun on its chest. So America is maximizing the pressures, extending the areas of sanctions on a daily basis, and simultaneously requesting and claiming that I'm ready to negotiate with Iran.
Views differed among the other parties to the deal: Russia, China, Germany, France, Britain, and the EU. And the meeting failed to draw a unified conclusion as Russia and China said the U.S. had breached the deal by pulling out and imposing sanctions. Apart from the U.S. and Iran, all parties concluded that it's best for them to remain committed to preserving the original deal. Hong Yoo, Arirang News.
South Korea's Supreme Court has ruled that the Justice Ministry was wrong more than a decade and a half ago to permanently ban a former K-pop star from entering the country. That's Yoo Seung-jun, who was widely considered a traitor for getting American citizenship just before he was supposed to start his military service. The court's ruling means the singer can appeal the Justice Ministry's decision and maybe come back to Korea. Lee Min-sun reports.
South Korea's Supreme Court has ruled that it's illegal for the nation's immigration service to refuse an entry visa for Korean-American singer Yoo Seung-jun, also known as Steve Yoo. Yoo debuted in Korea in 1997 and was one of the country's most popular celebrities, but found himself embroiled in a huge controversy in 2002 for evading mandatory military service after he obtained U.S. citizenship. The Ministry of Justice subsequently prohibited Yoo from entering Korea, citing Article 11 of the Immigration Act. It states that the Justice Ministry can ban the entry of anyone it deems highly likely to engage in activities that could undermine Korea's national interest or public security. It's been 17 years since Yoo last set foot on Korean soil, but the former star has been pleading with the authorities to allow him to return to Korea and resume his career. His visa application was turned down in 2015, prompting him to file a lawsuit against the Korean government. However, military service is a very sensitive issue in Korea, and public sentiments regarding Yoo remain cold. A recent public opinion survey conducted this month showed that 7 out of 10 respondents were opposed to allowing Yoo's entry to the country. Although the court ruling today does not immediately lift his travel ban, it will allow Yoo to appeal the previous decision from the Justice Ministry in hopes of securing his long-awaited return home. Lee Min-sun, Arirang News.
South Korea's foreign minister spoke on the phone Wednesday, Korea time, with U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo about the tensions between Seoul and Tokyo, as well as North Korea's denuclearization. Kim Mo-gyun has this report.
Speaking on the phone to U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, South Korea's Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa expressed concern over Japan's new export restrictions, claiming that they not only harm South Korean companies, but will also disrupt the global supply chain. Kang said the measures are not helpful to cooperative relations between Seoul and Tokyo or to trilateral ties with Washington. Furthermore, she said they could hurt American companies and the global trade order. In response, Pompeo said he understands Seoul's position and promised to work to strengthen America's diplomatic communication with its two core Asian allies. In their 15-minute phone call, Kang and Pompeo also touched on North Korea's denuclearization. They agreed that last month's historic trilateral summit at the DMZ between the leaders of the two Koreas and the U.S. built a foundation for concrete talks on denuclearization, and they agreed to continue working to achieve their shared goal of complete denuclearization and lasting peace on the Korean peninsula. The two decided to continue their dialogue next month on the sidelines of the ASEAN Regional Forum in Thailand. Kim Mo-gyan, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, senior South Korean officials are in Washington to meet with their U.S. counterparts and try to find a way to get Japan to change course. That could even mean mediation by Washington, which is an ally of both countries. Oh Soo-young has this report.
South Korea's Deputy National Security Advisor Kim Yeon-dong is in Washington to discuss major trade and security issues with his U.S. counterparts. The trip comes amid growing regional trade tensions after Japan imposed unprecedented export curbs on key high-tech components bound for South Korea. Speaking to reporters at Dallas International Airport on Wednesday local time before transferring planes for Washington, Kim confirmed the traceback will be one of the main topics of discussion.
I'm here as there are many issues to discuss with White House officials and lawmakers. That issue will certainly be discussed, most definitely.
Seoul's top diplomat for bilateral economic affairs Kim Hee-sang is also in Washington to meet his counterpart Roland de Marcellus of the U.S. State Department. He'll also sit down with Mark Napper, the State Department's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Korea and Japan, to discuss matters of mutual interest. Kim is expected to explain the potential impact of Tokyo's controversial trade measures and the possible spillover effect on global businesses.
Japan's strengthened trade regulations are a problem that disturbs the world trade order. We are planning to raise the issues one by one.
Seoul's Trade Minister Yoo Myung-hee is set to meet with U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer next week. South Korean companies produce 3/4 of the world's DRAM chips, about half of 3D NAND semiconductors, and the lion's share of OLED displays, which are used by other global IT giants such as US-based firms Apple and Dell. The South Korean officials are likely to ask Washington to defuse the trade spat before it escalates even further. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News.
South Korea has again strongly rejected claims by Tokyo that Seoul exported strategic items it got from Japan to North Korea. Seoul's trade ministry said on Thursday that Japan's allegations are groundless. It said South Korea has strict trade control systems and Japan should give evidence to support its claims. Tokyo's claimed that Seoul illegally sent the North strategic materials from Japan like hydrogen fluoride, which can be used in chemical weapons. The ministry said those materials were shipped to Vietnam or the UAE, not North Korea or any other country under UN sanctions. It also confirmed that working-level officials from South Korea and Japan will hold talks in Tokyo on Friday on Japan's export restrictions. Economists have been saying that those restrictions will hurt both countries, though to different degrees. A projection from one research institute suggests they might knock 2 or 3% off GDP. Our Ko Jun-hee explains.
Speaking Wednesday at a seminar on the impact of Japan's export restrictions, a senior research fellow from the Korea Economic Research Institute said they'll end up doing more harm than good to both economies. Researcher Cho Kyung-yup said that if Korean companies suffer a 30% drop in semiconductor-related supplies, South Korea's annual GDP would drop by around 2.2%. The three materials affected by the export curbs are photoresist, fluorinated polymers, and hydrogen fluoride, necessary to make semiconductors or displays. Analysts have been saying the move will hurt Korea's economy, around 1/5 of whose exports last year were chips. And Cho forecast that Japan's GDP would also edge down 0.04%. But if Seoul were to retaliate by restricting exports on chips and chip components to Tokyo, things would likely get worse. South Korea's GDP would slump at least by 3%, Cho estimates, and Japan's by around 1.8%. Cho points out that if Seoul does retaliate in a major way, it stands to lose more than Japan, which would replace Korean firms with suppliers in Japan or China. To ease the tensions, analysts at the seminar recommended solving the problem diplomatically, rather than by economic attrition. And such conversations between the two governments, they said, need to start as soon as possible. 고르니, Arirang News.
It's time now for an in-depth look at the global markets this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yoo, global strategist at QM Securities. Mr. Yoo, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me today.
Wall Street was up overnight on hopes of an interest rate cut from the Fed. The S&P, the Dow, and the NASDAQ, all three touching record highs. What's the story today?
Yes, as you said, the U.S. stock market climbed quite nicely on back of Federal Reserve Chairman Powell's dovish statements. He said that he will respond appropriately, saying that in the testimony of House Financial Services Commission yesterday. Uncertainty such as trade dispute and global economic slowdown is putting pressure and threat to the U.S. economic growth rate. That's what Powell said. And that is taken as the potential for rate cut on the July 31st. And that has resulted into quite significant rise of the U.S. market. Dow rose 0.29%, NASDAQ jumped by 0.75%, and Russell 2000 rose 0.16%. Also, S&P 500 was up 0.45%. Now, the last Friday, the better-than-expected job report put pressure on the market globally as well as U.S. market because maybe the rate cut is not coming because of the better-than-expected economic growth rate, but that was not so as what Powell said. So clearly that is lifting up the equity market, expecting additional money supply coming through, additional liquidity coming through into the system. Kospi recovered today quite nicely by 0.16%. Kosdaq was up also 1.53% after 1.8% rise yesterday. So clearly, heavily bitten down sectors are recovering because of the positive news coming from the U.S. side. As for Chinese market, they're showing flat number. Today it was up about 0.1% for Shanghai index, but Shenzhen index was down 0.15%. The main reason for that is because we're not sure whether Chinese government will be aggressively putting in additional liquidity into the system yet. They have not talked about possibility of rate cuts yet. So therefore, uncertainty still lingers on Chinese equity market.
Yeah, well, staying with the interest rate issue, it's a pretty quick turnaround there from the thinking we had last Friday, as you mentioned. What's Powell's thinking here, and what's the outlook now in terms of, for example, how many times the Fed might cut rates this year and by how much?
Sure. Powell expressed that Fed's overall monetary policy stands through the documentation before the hearing actually began. And if you look at the documentations, what he says is that despite the recent employment report that U.S.-China trade dispute truce that came through, uncertainty still remains quite significantly for U.S. economic outlook. And that uncertainty seems to be widening, according to Powell's statement. The sluggishness of major economic indicators in Europe as well as Asia continued, and this is putting pressure for the economic outlook for USA. And also, he said that in addition to economic outlook, the lower inflationary environment is here to stay, and he expects that to be lasting quite a long period of time. And because of that, he's saying that the rate cut is possible, we think. Also, he has said that whether or not the labor market is overheating, he has said that it cannot find any evidence in regards to the labor market being too hot. So therefore, possibility of rate cut is coming through further. So we think that rate cut on July 31st first is most likely because the rate rise that they did on December of last year was probably the wrongdoing. So one-time cut will be done probably end of this month. But after that, whether or not additional cut will be coming will be depending on how the economic growth takes its toll. And we do think that the economic slowdown will happen, but the size of that slowdown is not going to be too significant. We think that 2.5% growth rate is possible still. So therefore, if there's any additional rate cut, probably coming in December rather than any time sooner. So at most, 2 times rate cut we're expecting. Even with that, though, equity market should do well because of the additional liquidity is injected to the system.
Yeah, all eyes on July 31st. Now, here in Korea, the Minimum Wage Council has convened to set next year's minimum hourly pay. Labor started out asking for it to be raised to 10,000 won an hour, as President Moon pledged in his election campaign. Business, though, actually demanding a cut. What's going on with the minimum wage?
Right. As you said, the difference is too large between the labor union versus the management. The Minimum Wage Committee will be held in the afternoon again. The Park Jong-sik, the chairman of the Minimum Wage Committee, said that the meeting has to have quickly finished, and he would like to see some kind of settlement done on minimum wage for 2020 by July 11th. But the problem is the difference between the labor and management sector are too large, and it is very difficult to find a middle ground. Labor is asking minimum wage of 10,000, which is rising by 19.8% for next year, versus management is asking 8,000, which will be about 4.2% cut. The Minimum Wage Committee submitted a first amendment through the negotiations. So the labor union have submitted a lower version of 9,571, which is still 14.6% rise, versus management saying that 8,185 won, which is only 2% cut. But still, the gap is very large. So I'm not sure whether this is going to settle very quickly. The chairman wants to be settle this thing by July 11th, but we will see how this plays out. We think that with the economic growth rate slowing down very rapidly, the minimum wage rise by 2-digit number will be probably unlikely. They will come into some kind of agreement that minimum wage will rise by single digit, but not that much.
Yeah, 19.8% might be a bridge too far this time. All right, Mr. Yoo, that's where we'll have to leave it today. Thanks so much for coming on and sharing your insights.
Thank you very much.
Now, as mentioned, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, has hinted at a rate cut coming up soon. It would be the first in the U.S. in 10 years. In prepared remarks to Congress, Powell highlighted the risks facing the American economy. Yoo Seung-jun reports.
Testifying before the U.S. House Committee on Financial Services on Wednesday, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell vowed to steer the strong U.S. economy through a fraught road of international trade spats and a global slowdown.
The economy performed reasonably well over the first half of 2019, and the current expansion is now in its 11th year. However, inflation has been running below the FOMC's symmetric 2% objective, and cross-currents, such as trade tensions and concerns about global growth, have been weighing on economic activity and the outlook.
With that, Powell strongly hinted that a rate cut is coming down the line later this month. If it happens, it will be the Fed's first cut in a decade. After Powell's announcement, the Dow rallied on Wednesday, and the S&P 500 crossed the 3,000-point mark for the first time in history. Meanwhile, brushing aside repeated criticism from President Trump, Powell insisted he will not step down even if Trump asked him to resign. The Fed chief stressed that the law guarantees him a 4-year term, and he fully intends to serve it out. But President Trump still appears to have got what he wanted, namely a rate cut. Trump has long insisted lower rates will help the U.S. economy grow even faster as he prepares to try and win re-election in 2020. Yoo Seung-jun, Arirang News.
The Seoul metropolitan government is implementing stronger measures to keep people cool this summer, especially the vulnerable. The city advises people to stay indoors when heat wave warnings or alerts are issued and to make use of the capital's 26 cooling shelters. The shelters have air conditioning, shower rooms, and even TVs. 3 mobile bath vehicles for homeless people will operate in 5 areas. Nurses will do daily checkups on the homeless, on people over 65 years old, and on those with disabilities or chronic illnesses. Private companies will also sponsor free drinking water, food, and electric fans. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.